Welcome back, everyone, to the Spring 2024 New York Times Speaker Series featuring reporter Maya King with her session, All In, Voters, Movements, and Messages of the 2024 U.S. Elections. My name is Michelle Zaldivar, your program manager here at the Office of Global Learning Initiatives. A reminder to please take a moment to sign in if you haven't already. We've got these QR codes up in the room and posted all around in the front. This is where we'll capture everyone's attendance and report back. So whether you're here for honors engagement points, global learning medallion points, or credit from your professor, that's where we capture all that information to report it back. We'll have lots of time to engage in today's session. So we ask that everyone please use one of the mics. We'll have those roaming mics moving along the outside aisles for your convenience so that we can hear everyone's contributions on the recording. Medallion students, please take sure that you take a screenshot of that confirmation page to include on your points log. If you'd like to learn more about other undergraduate programs available from the Office of Global Learning Initiatives, including the Excellence in Global Learning Medallion, Peace Corps Prep, and Millennium Fellowship, we encourage you to connect with us on social media and sign up on our website, goglobal.fiu.edu. We also have our entire team joining us here today. We've got our graduate assistants, our assistant director in charge of student programming, our senior program director, senior program coordinator, another program coordinator joining us in the audience. We're glad here to answer all of your questions today. This special event is part of an extension of our ongoing Tuesday Times Roundtable discussion series that brings together multiple perspectives on current global issues and trends. It happens every Tuesday through the academic year right across the hall in GC 150. But this special session, the New York Times Speaker Series, and our regular TTR series are part of an ongoing partnership between FIU and the New York Times that brings digital access to the New York Times to every single student, every single community member with an @FIU.edu email address. So if you haven't already, you can activate your digital subscription at accessnyt.com. This week's link, because TTR is always linked to an article, is actually linked to our journalist page on the New York Times, so you can read a little bit more about Maya's reporting and see all of her bylines on the New York Times at go.fiu.edu/TTR0312. To introduce Maya today, please join me in welcoming the thought leader behind all things global learning for global citizenship here at FIU and the founding director of our office, Assistant Vice President of Global Learning Initiatives, Dr. Hilary Landorf. And then you can click to the next for Maya's.
The next for mine. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us. You all get A's in all your courses for being here. Let me say that. So I have the honor of introducing you to our speaker today, Maya King. Maya joined the New York Times in 2022, moving from Washington to Atlanta to cover the midterm races for governor and U.S. Senate in Georgia. This year, she's covering the 2024 presidential race and other down-ballot races by speaking with potential voters in the American South and writing about trends related particularly to Black voters and young people. Maya was born and raised in Florida, in Tallahassee, and graduated with a BA in journalism from Howard University. Not to embarrass her, but in 2017, as a major in journalism at Howard, Maya was featured at a White House Correspondents Association website. Here, in this website, we find out that she was not only campus editor of Howard's campus newspaper and co-host of the Rerun podcast, but that she won the National Association of Black Journalists Salute to Excellence Award for Collegiate Feature Writing. She was an Annenberg Honors Program Scholar. She was an Online News Association HBCU Fellow. And that, in her own words, her hope was to, quote, cover Congress with a special interest in the relationship between race and public policy as it affects the country's poor, Black, and brown populations. Just a few years later, and Maya is doing just that at the newspaper of record, the New York Times. Maya has always applied the best of global learning to her reporting. In each of her stories, she actively listens to others, not to repeat what they say, but to try to capture each person's unique perspective and connect others' lives with their unique wants, griefs, anxieties, and hopes to our own. This takes a most generous and open person, someone who can hold the local and the global, the individual and the collective in their head and in their heart at the same time. This person is very special, and her name is Maya King. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Landorf, and thank you, FIU, for having me. I am so excited to be here with you guys, and really excited to talk a little bit more about my reporting and about the 2024 election and what we're thinking about at the New York Times. So really excited to get into it. As Dr. Landorf mentioned, I was born and raised in Tallahassee, so I am a native Floridian. This is my first time at FIU, but I'm really happy to be here. This was a school that was on my college list when I was in high school, so I'm happy to be on campus and happy to be talking to students. Many of you are members of Gen Z, which is a very important generation that we're following in 2024. And I also am a Gen Zer, so glad to be among peers. But yes, let's get right into it. There we go. So today I'll be talking with you guys about the candidates, who are the people running for president in 2024, the issues that are animating the election and why we're focusing on them so closely. I'll talk to you a little bit about our reporting process at the New York Times and how we cover this election, how we're thinking about it, and then want to leave plenty of room for questions. But please, along the way, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt me, any comments or questions that you have along the way. Don't wait until the end. I really want this to be a conversation, and I'm really hoping to learn from you. So let us begin. So I thought I would start here with just a few kind of random numbers. We've got 12.3 billion, 8, 41 million, 11,779, and 158.4 million. They all represent major trends and important figures that related to the 2020 and 2024 election. But I wonder if anyone has any guesses as to what any of these figures could mean. Yes.
Do they relate to the
Yes, so exactly. So whatever you see on the on one side.
I'm just going to take a safe guess and say that 8 is the number of presidential candidates.
Yes. Any other guesses?
Maybe 41 million is the number of Gen Z voters who will be eligible in 2024?
Possibly. Yes?
The dollar amount is 12.3 billion?
Yes.
A lot of money.
Any other guesses? Yep.
Okay. The 11,000 number is the President Joe Biden margin of victory in Georgia.
Yeah, you guys are good. Okay. I'll line them up in the next slide, but any other guesses before?
158 is the total number of people who voted in 2020.
You are correct. So let's run through them. You guys pretty much got them right. So I started from the bottom up. 158.4 million. Yes, that is the total number of people who voted in the 2020 presidential election. That was actually an increase from 2016 and is about 2/3 or 66% of the electorate, of the number of eligible voters in this country. So it's a pretty significant figure. And when you think about the fact that this was the year of COVID, where a lot of people were sick, a lot of people were in the house, it's pretty amazing that 2/3 of voters were able to get out when you consider the average, which is a little bit closer to 1/3. 11,779. Yes, that was President Biden's margin of victory in Georgia in 2020. I include that figure, one, because today is actually the presidential primary in Georgia, so folks are voting for president as we speak in my new home state. And it also underlines just how close a lot of these races really are and how much goes into turning out voters and securing these historic victories, which we can talk a little bit more about later on. 41 million, the number of Gen Z voters who will be eligible to vote in 2024. So that includes those who are already in the generation, everyone aged 18 to 27, and those people who will vote, or excuse me, people who will turn 18 this year before November. It's 41 million people, so very significant, able to make a huge difference in November. 8 presidential candidates on the ticket. We can talk about them in a minute. And yes, $12.3 billion are projected to be spent on the 2024 election. In 2020, both parties, Republican and Democrat, spent an average of $77 per vote. And that number will get up a little bit closer to $90. A lot of that's going to be spent on TV. How many of you watch TV, have cable? Yeah, it's like 2 people. Okay. But more of that, because of the trends that we're seeing and because more people are shifting to digital, more of that will be on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and other online outlets for more political ads. So prepare to be flooded this year. So this just goes to show you, when you look at the numbers, there's a lot more obviously that goes into elections, but it factors a lot into election results. And all of this really boils down to votes, which is the most important part of this year and what we're looking at most closely. So we talked about the numbers, talked a little bit about how much people might spend on your vote, but who's actually running and who are these people? So these are the lists of people who are running for president in 2024. There are 8 people running as Democrats, Republicans, and third-party candidates. That's Independent and Green Party. On the New York Times website, Michelle, if you don't mind clicking the link, you'll see a fully blown-up web page that actually explores who's running for president in 2024. I didn't say at the top of this, but part of my presentation is just going to be a lot of encouragement to you guys to make the most use of your New York Times subscription. Because I am a New York Times employee, of course, I'm a little bit biased, but I will say that our coverage of this election is extremely comprehensive, and if you just start here, you'll get a lot of really great information. You'll see on this page more topics around who's actually running, more about the candidates other than Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who they are and what they represent. Further down on the page, we also have a timeline, so you're able to see how long a person ran for office. That includes some of the candidates from 2016 and 2020. And if you look, I mean, some of these are ongoing campaigns, obviously, and some of them were quite short. So it's good to kind of look back and see these campaign timelines. There's also individual blocks that offer a little bit more information about each candidate further down. So who they are, how they got into politics, and what their stances are on key issues. And at the very bottom of the page here, you'll find more of our reporting at the Times and an overview of some of the biggest political stories of the week that we're on top of. So we are covering this election really from wall to wall, and you'll be able to see just how much factors into that and some of the stories that are leading our site for the day. Are there any candidates on this list that folks might not have heard of, might not have seen before, are surprised to see? Wow, okay, so everybody knows these folks. Okay, yes? West and Stein. Yes, so Cornel West and Jill Stein are also running as third-party candidates. And we are, at the Times, looking at those candidacies or those campaigns pretty closely because As most of you know, Joe Biden and Donald Trump ran for president, of course, in 2020. And here in 2024, there are a lot of voters who are interested in other candidates. So these third-party campaigns might play a really crucial role as we get closer to November. Yes. Oh.
I just had a question. I'm not from the U.S. I'm from Mexico. So the way that we vote is different, and I wanted to ask you, I see only 3 parties. In Mexico, we have different parties as well. And then you said the primary elections. So could you go a little bit more into depth about what the primary elections are, and then how did you end up having just two people at the end actually going to be elected?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So the first 3 months of this year saw a lot of primary elections in several key early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. When we went into Iowa in January, I believe there were about 3 or 4 Republican candidates and 3 Democratic candidates. The way that the primaries work, there are also caucuses, which are a little bit more informal and wonky, but I can explain that further down. But voters of Republican and Democratic voters will have a chance to say who they would like to represent their party at the top of the ticket for president. And these states are worth electoral votes. And if this were a more competitive election, you would probably see more candidates really fighting for these electoral votes. And whoever wins the most becomes the party's nominee. And so this was a little bit harder for us to watch or to track this year because President Biden was running largely unopposed. None of the Democrats who were running in the primary got any electoral votes. They might have gotten a little bit of support in some of these states, but nothing to really take home. And the same is really true of former President Trump as well. Both of these candidates won overwhelmingly in the states that have already voted in their primaries. And one other point, last Tuesday we refer to as Super Tuesday because so many people, so many states voted, and there were so many electoral votes up for grabs. I hope I didn't get too wonky there. Let me know if that makes sense. Okay, great. Yes, so these are the folks who are running. This is when you look at your ballot, who you can expect to see. Obviously, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but Jill Stein, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Cornel West will also definitely be on the ballot. Well, in most states. Not in all states. Yeah, not in all states, thank you, but in several. And so this is November's most likely matchup. Here we have President Biden, who's running for re-election, former President Donald Trump, who's also running for a second term. This is really the focus of our coverage. This is really the focus of our coverage because these are the 2 candidates who have garnered the most support, and it is certainly likely that one of these 2 candidates will win in November. And the way that we cover this election, the way that we're thinking about it, because we have seen this matchup before, is not so much about who's up, who's down, who's ahead, though we do that a lot in our polling, and I can talk about that. But it's also about the stakes and the impact of what a second Trump term could mean or a second Biden term could mean for folks' everyday lives and the really key aspects of policymaking. So we've talked a little bit about the candidates, a little bit about the money, but many of you may be asking, what are you voting for exactly? And maybe talking frequently about it. I hope so, like what you can expect from your day-to-day life, depending on who is in the White House. So I've identified a handful of issues in my reporting that have been top of mind for me and things or themes that I've noticed voters talk about most. One of the first issues that I hear a lot about is democracy. So the preservation of democratic norms, that is free and fair elections, access to the ballot for all people, and making sure that multiracial coalitions, so Black and brown folks in particular, have access to the ballot and have no arbitrary limits on their ability to vote. The economy is another big issue that's come up in a lot of my conversations with voters. We just find that when we go to events and ask people what they really care about and what they'll be voting for, they're talking a lot about the economy, particularly prices of things, inflation, and how that has a significant impact on their attitudes about both of these candidates. And it also we found that there's a little bit of a gap in how voters think about the economy and its impact on their lives. So we call that a class gap in how people are thinking about the economy. International relations is another really big topic that's animating this election. So the war in Israel, between Israel and Hamas, and the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip has been a real test of Biden's presidency. And it's also created a lot of tension between him and key aspects of his coalition among Democrats, particularly young people and people of color. The war in Ukraine is also a big topic of interest, and how much the United States is funding it has been something that's come up a lot in conversations with voters. And of course, it's turned a lot of people's attention to Congress in Washington, which is in charge of a lot of that funding. And we're also following the crisis in Haiti at the moment. That's another big topic that's front of mind for many voters, particularly Black voters, and certainly those who are here in South Florida. Climate change is another really big issue, and I think that's really front of mind for young voters. It's an issue that's been quite politicized, whether or not people are prepared for it and whether or not, it's something that's really happening, I think is still a question that's on the minds of many voters. Things like floods, hurricanes, storm surge. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that. I know I am as a native Floridian, and just how prepared a lot of these states are for these natural disasters is something that I've heard a lot from young voters. I've also heard about technology's influence, AI, social media, and what that could mean for the spread of information around the election. I'll pause here for a moment and ask if there are any other issues that are front of mind for folks. Well, first, who's planning on voting in November this year? Okay, full house. Love to see it. What are some of the issues that I might not have mentioned that are going to really impact your vote?
Reproductive justice. I think we've seen a lot with, I should probably introduce myself. So my name is Brittany, she, her pronouns, the current program manager for the Women's Center. Thinking about reproductive justice, access to proper care for women, I think after the overturn of Roe versus Wade, and even thinking about now what's going on with IVF, that I think is going to be an important issue specifically for marginalized groups, marginalized women, and how, they decide to vote based off what's at stake. Thinking about abortion outlaws across the board.
Absolutely. Yes, abortion is a huge, huge topic. Definitely don't want to leave that out. Any other issues that are front of mind for folks?
Not issues front of mind, but I wanted to ask a question. Do you find a difference in when you ask voters or potential voters to free associate what are the issues versus giving them a list of issues and numerically, reading the issues? Is there a difference in the kinds of or the issues themselves that are cited?
Yes, I try to leave it open so that I can, leave open the possibility that someone will say something that surprises me. I usually go into a conversation with a voter and ask, what are the issues that are top of mind for you? And that's how I came up with this. But in our polling, that's where a lot of the sort of lists, rank where this is, are you more or less likely to vote according to this issue, is really where that comes in. And if I need to do reporting to bolster that, then I'll go out and ask, well, what do you think of the economy or gas prices or abortion access, et cetera? Anyone else?
Hello? Yeah. One issue that, I don't think it'll be impacting my vote all that much, but for a lot of people, immigration seems to be a really big issue, especially here in a state like Florida where so many people are coming from multiracial, multicultural backgrounds. I think immigration is going to play a really big role, especially considering the fact that one candidate really likes talking about it a lot more than the other candidate.
Absolutely. Immigration is a huge issue this year. Anyone else? Last one. Yeah.
In terms of economy, is it like the perception of the economy or is it actual numbers?
A little bit of both. We talk about the vibe session and have written about that before. A lot of people have this real perception in their mind that things are just really, really bad. And I think that's because prices are higher, and so that automatically makes things more difficult. But when you talk to economists, they say, well, things are actually not too bad. And if you look closely at the numbers, we're pretty healthy. But that has not yet really registered in the minds of voters. Okay, I'll move along so that we can leave some more room open. So this is another website that we have, or another feature that we have on the website, is our issues tracker. So if it's regularly updated, and we look at where particularly the Republican candidates stand on a range of issues. And so the reason why this is a focus on Republicans is because they had a competitive primary in 2024 where Democrats really did not. It was largely Biden who was running. So we thought that we would really go in depth here and talk about all of the different issues that are animating this election. And you can see where every Republican who ran for president in 2024 stands on these topics. I would really encourage you to look through it. We'll have more reporting, and already do, on the Democrats and how Biden and many of his allies are viewing the next possible administration and where they fall on a lot of these topics. But here's just another feature that's available to you right now on our homepage. So I will. Alrighty, so I've talked a little bit about the numbers, talked about the issues, and I thought that I would run through with you guys a little bit more about the reporting process. So at the New York Times, we spend a lot of time identifying the issues and how they change in the minds of voters, in the speeches of candidates, how they trickle up, and also in the halls of Congress, how they actually impact lawmaking. So here's a look at some of our coverage over just the last few weeks. So the Times is kind of known, at least this year, for our polling. We have a very robust polling operation in partnership with Siena College, and it has really come into full view this year as our polls on the 2024 election have garnered a lot of attention. So we probably conduct polls every 6 to 10 weeks. Most of these polls are concentrated in battleground states, so states that have flipped between both candidates over the last few election cycles. States like Wisconsin, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And our last poll that was conducted about 2 weeks ago, the top line result, as you can see on this slide, is a majority of voters that we surveyed favored Trump over Biden by about 5 points. That is just one part of all of the polling that we do. We also report out these figures, but that is really where we start, is sort of the horse race, is what we call it, who's ahead of who. Our polling team does do a lot of the heavy lifting in conducting this poll and presenting its findings. So these are not reporters who are sitting down and actually writing the stories. These are the people who are crunching the numbers for us. But as reporters, we're actually tasked with really making sense of those findings for our readers. So outside of those top line numbers, we actually go back and we call these voters. We have a spreadsheet with their names and their locations and their phone numbers. And after we poll them, we ask if they would be open to being contacted by a New York Times journalist. And those who say that they are usually do get a call from one of us to ask exactly why they responded the way that they did. So in addition to asking voters' thoughts on who they'll vote for, how likely they are to vote in November, what other issues might matter to them outside of the ones that were asked in the initial survey, we also get even more information about their preferences. We ask about their personal lives and why they decided to even answer the phone call from the New York Times. And we include a lot of those insights in our stories because we want readers to know that there really are real people behind these numbers and behind these trends. And so much of what we do at the Times is building trust with readers and making sure that they understand just how much goes into our reporting. And so we try to make the most of these numbers. Not only are they written about in stories like this that lead the site with a big overview, but they also can end up in our podcast episodes. We've done vertical videos as well, and I'll talk a little bit more later about our other story forms, but we really do like to use the most of our polling. I give that long overview because I know that polls are a little bit controversial this year, and many candidates' campaigns, they question whether or not they can be trusted, but we do the best we can to assure people that they indeed can be. So here is a quick run through of some of our polling. Do you mind clicking the Trump Black voter story? Sorry, I jumped ahead actually. So this is the story about our Siena poll from 2 weeks ago. And it's just a story that kind of is an overview of our polling. And then late last year, my colleague and I, Lisa Lehrer, we looked a little bit more closely at one of the trends that we identified in November among Black voters, and that was their openness to supporting a Republican presidential candidate. So I talked about how we reach out to some of the people that we surveyed. I'll read a quote from one voter that I reached in McDonough, Georgia, which is an Atlanta suburb. She said, "My clients are mostly Black. She's Black. They voted Democrat last year, and they all said next election that they're going to vote Republican." And that was what she told me when I reached her by phone after she participated in our poll. I also talked to another voter in Pennsylvania. Her name was Talitha McLaren, and she's a home health aide. And she said, "Don't get me wrong, I'm going to support the Democrats, but they haven't won me over yet on what they're trying to do for the country, because what they're doing right now ain't working." So that was kind of a more nuanced view, I thought, of someone who is interested and has supported Democrats and said that she would, but still wants to see more results. And I think it's just another example of, how we really try to underline the human element behind some of these numbers. Any questions on our polls? I know I went through a lot there. Okay, I'll move on. So our bread and butter in 2024 is our coverage of special events. So Super Tuesday, as I mentioned, was last Tuesday. And the reason why we call it Super Tuesday is because that is a night where the most number of states in one United States territory will cast ballots for a president. It, as you can see, was largely a Trump sweep. Even though it was competitive, he was running against Nikki Haley, but she just won one state. So, we try to make use of as many reporters and resources as we have at the New York Times. So our live coverage is a big part of our special events. And we also partner with reporters outside of the politics team, those who might be based in some of these states, to report about what's going on the ground. We also partner with actually the Associated Press. So if you've ever looked at the New York Times website and you see some of the results coming in, how many of you are familiar with the needle? It kind of moves over, depending on who's up or who's down. I don't know how closely you guys might follow the Times online. The data that powers the needle comes from the Associated Press, actually. So they're the only news outlet that has as comprehensive data to call these elections for us, and that's what powers our coverage on election nights. Other special events this year, Joe Biden's State of the Union was last week, and that was another really big coverage night for us. And coming up, I think our next big special event will probably be, one of Trump's court appearances, because those are kind of an all day, all hands on deck moment, and they're based in New York, and we're in New York. Our headquarters is, so that's probably where we'll spend a lot of our time. Any questions on our special events? So this is probably my favorite thing, and this is really what I spend most of my time doing, and that's field reporting. The most important part of our jobs as journalists is to talk to people, and sometimes finding the right story and the right people to talk to can take us to really interesting places. This is a picture of Keith Bradsher. He's our Beijing bureau chief, and he was writing a story about new metro tunnels in China, but rather than, or I guess in addition to, talking to transportation experts in China, maybe government officials, he actually went into the tunnels themselves. And so it's pretty cool. Like, we're able to go to a lot of different places. I am based in Georgia, and we don't have an actual brick and mortar office there. So when I'm not, working from home at my desk, which is probably 2 or 3 times a week, I'm in the field, I'm at events, and talking to people there, or meeting with sources around Georgia or around the South, and filing or writing my stories, often from my car or any place I can just find a little bit of internet. So we're very much in the story, which matters. And so here's a few other links to stories for folks that or for folks who kind of went as close to the story as you could. Our White House correspondent flew all the way to Alaska to talk to the people who are tasked with kind of looking at the United States atmosphere to hunt for UFOs. And this was a response actually to, if anyone remembers, the Chinese spy balloon craze. So we actually, as it was happening, we sent someone to Alaska to get as up high in the sky as she possibly could to understand the origins of not only the spy balloons, but the UFOs. Another story that took one of our reporters really into, I guess, the belly of the beast was our politics reporter, Ested Herndon, went to Trumpstock, which in 2020 was a gathering of some of the most faithful Republicans and supporters of President Trump. This was summer 2020, and these were also people who were gun enthusiasts. So if you guys are familiar with a bump stock, it's a part of a gun, and Trump stock's kind of a play on that. Ested went to this gathering, talked to these voters, spent time with them, and one of the major themes that emerged from those conversations, mind you, this was, I think, halfway through 2020, summer 2020, people were calling for political violence then. And this was well ahead of January 6th, really ahead of the presidential election in 2020. But it was such an important story because it really made clear to our readers this is a thing that could happen. And that Ested not only, said that and made that claim, he actually went to one of these events and talked to the people there to really say these are folks who, I think in our headline, nothing less than a civil war if Trump were to lose. And that was, again, in 2020. And I have spent a lot of time, as I said, in the stories. So I went to South Carolina. I spent the better part of February in South Carolina to understand Democrats' message to black voters. So after I wrote the story about our poll and analyzed the numbers a little bit more, when the election or the primaries got into full swing, I spent about 3 weeks in South Carolina talking to black voters there and really following around a lot of the Democrats who were campaigning for Joe Biden there. You would ask why I did that, because it was largely uncompetitive. But again, I was trying to understand what the message would be to these voters when they really were showing a lack of interest in Democrats and possibly just deciding to stay home altogether. So I thought it was an important reporting trip for me and kind of set the tone for my coverage for the year. And the Times allowed me to basically camp out in a different state for a long time, just to make sure that I had a full handle on what that could look like. Any questions on our coverage and how we think about travel to different places, field reporting, ins and outs of journalism? Yes?
Hi. So my question is that when they send you somewhere, do you know how long you have to stay there? And do you have a say? Like, if you're like, oh, I really don't want to go there, can you you say that?
It depends. I mean, there have definitely been. So to your first question, I'll say usually we kind of keep a timeline. So if we know that a candidate we're very interested in say, the North Carolina governor's race, if I'm going to follow the Democrat and I know he has 3 events over 2 days, then I'll just be there for like 2 or 3 days. So just enough time to go to the events, file a story, and come home. If I want to stay longer because I want to talk to people there, or in the example of South Carolina where there weren't that many events, but I was just wanting to like really be on the ground, I could stay a little bit longer, 4 or 5 days or 2 weeks. But those longer reporting trips usually require clearance from our top editors. And yes, there are a lot of times where we prefer not to go, or, so many times this happens, a kind of a regular feature of journalism where you're halfway through the work week and you are ready to start planning your weekend, and then you get a call from your editor and they say, can you get on a plane and go to, I don't know, anywhere that they need you to go, and spend the next couple days there. We really want a story on this. And it's like, oh, there goes my weekend. And unless it's like, something really, really important, you kind of have to say, okay, all right, I'll go.
Sent to Arizona? Got meetings in Arizona?
No, I haven't. I have really been relegated to the Deep South. That is where I spend almost all of my time. So I have 8 states under my purview, and they keep me busy enough. But I think the furthest that I've gone is to fill in for a reporter, I think in Michigan last year.
So when you do have to go on ahead and write stories and find information on topics that you're not necessarily so interested in or don't call towards your personal attention, I know it can be probably difficult or is it difficult to write about those kind of things when it doesn't necessarily fall into your personal likings, or for you personally, is it easier to keep an open mind?
It depends. It is difficult, especially when, rarely am I sent on a reporting trip for a story that I just have no idea what I'll be doing, but it has happened. And that's when I have to really my first calls are to all of my colleagues and just say, like, where do I go? Where do I stay? Who do I talk to? And I have also been sent to places that I might know what to do there, but I just don't really feel like it. But there are ways to really make the reporting trips fun. You end up getting a chance to talk to interesting people. I found that it's always the reporting trips that I least want to go on and the candidates who I least want to cover that tend to produce some of the best stories, just because I'm like, well, I don't want to do this, but I might as well go talk to this person. Okay, I might as well just go and talk to this person too. All right, I might as well just ask this person if they have some time for coffee. Okay, I guess I might and then before you know it, you've got a full story with all these voices that comes together. But there definitely are times where you're like, let me just go so I can come back, which I think is true of anyone in any job. Anything else? Oh,
for those of us who are aspiring journalists, can you talk a little bit about how, sort of like really the logistics of how you write a story with another person? Because I see several of your stories are with someone else. So, for example, do you split up the work and then put it back together? Do you actually write together? Who does the editing? What's that process like?
Yes, that is a great question. It's a very collaborative and sometimes chaotic process to team up with another person, especially for me, at being so far away from the newsroom in New York or DC. So sometimes the way it comes together is we'll see a big trend, something big might happen in politics, and for example, Biden's State of the Union. An editor might reach out to me and say, can you go out and just talk to a bunch of people about what they thought of Biden's State of the Union? Because there's another reporter who's writing a story maybe about, the American public's response to big speeches. And so I will do that and maybe write up the best of the reporting that I've gotten and then send it to that reporter, and they'll write it all the way through. I co-authored a story that published yesterday that was about the North Carolina governor's race, and it took some of my reporting from being in North Carolina last week and my colleagues' reporting from being in Georgia with me later in the week, and we were in two totally different places, but we basically operated like in a Google Doc and just kind of wrote together. I took the lead, which one reporter usually does, in writing everything out, shaping which people get quoted the highest up and everything like that. And then they can come in and, do their second kind of read of it, throw in the reporting that they have, and we'll just go back and forth like that. Yes.
One question that I had is, with all the data and research that you collect, do you use everything? Because I see that some parts, or some stories are not that long. So what happens to all the research that you do? Does it go to waste? Like, do you have a database? What happens?
So much gets left on the cutting room floor. And I'll speed ahead to our other story forms. It's actually a perfect segue because I could write a story that's 1,500 words, which might sound like a lot, but it really is not a ton. It's probably a 5-minute read. And maybe it has 4 quotes or 4 people quoted in it, but I probably talk to 7 or 8 people. And if I'm working with another person, they talk to an additional 7 or 8. And so part of the collaboration also is a little bit of a bargain, like, oh, I really want to make sure that we squeeze this person in, or I really want to make sure that we quote them. And we just have time constraints, so a lot of that gets, discarded or left in our notebook, as it were. And at the end of the presidential election, for the reporters who cover Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they will have a lot of stuff that kind of accumulates over the year that they just weren't able to use. And that does tend to go into the stories about how this candidate won or lost. And so they're able to come back at it and call those people back or go back to those sources. But what we can't use goes into a lot of our other story forms. So here you can see the digital, or I guess mobile version of our Super Tuesday results. That's our polling. You can't do it on this because it's just a PowerPoint, but if you were to scroll down on your phone or on the New York Times app, which you would have access to, you can see our live blog, and that's where, we almost have like little tweets kind of baked into the website, and that's where some of our reporting goes that couldn't go into stories. We also make more wide use of vertical video. That's a video of me when I went to South Carolina. I think that was about halfway through my 3-week adventure there. And I was not only giving an overview of the South Carolina Democratic primary, but also like finding ways to talk about things that I reported and found but couldn't actually fit into stories. So saying things like, I talked to a voter and they told me this, or I talked to the state party chair and they let me know that they'll be doing this later. And being able to kind of use that's really invaluable. And then our audio team is really robust. So we have a politics podcast called The Run Up, and that's also hosted by Ested Herndon. I'd highly, highly, highly suggest that you listen to it. It's a really great weekly breakdown of all the things that are happening in politics and some of the major themes in a very digestible, down-to-earth way of thinking about them. And reporters on the politics team are on the show pretty regularly, and that's another chance for us to actually use recordings of our conversations that didn't get, this aren't written, but it maybe wasn't, the quotes weren't used in the story, so you can actually hear the voices of the people we talk to. And we'll talk more at length, like in settings like this, but on a podcast form, to be able to explain a little bit more about what we found in our reporting. Any other questions about our alternative story forms? Great, okay. So we're wrapping up here, and I thought I would just share with you a few of the quotes that I've gathered over the years. So speaking of the cutting room floor, I've got Brian Kemp quoted along the bottom. He's the governor of Georgia. When he was running for governor, he talked a lot about how in 2021, after Georgia passed a pretty restrictive voting law, the Major League Baseball Association actually pulled the All-Star game out of Georgia. And then he says, but we got justice when the Braves won the World Series. And that's always something that gets a ton of applause, and people just love to hear him say it. And it was a big part of his re-election message in 2022. I also talked and still talk quite a bit to Jim Clyburn, the congressman from South Carolina, who's a very close ally and confidant of President Biden. And in 2023, when I started to see signs that Black voters were drifting away from Biden, I asked, what do people like you and other Democrats have to do to bring them back? And he said, we've got to go out and let people know that the future can be different if we get different people in office. I also talked to a lot of voters at events or driving around Georgia or any state that I'm in, trying to understand what's on their minds. And one Trump voter, this is a person who I believe was actually going to still vote for Trump, but I asked him his thoughts on the former president, and he said he always shoots his mouth off, and that he's his own worst enemy. And I also talked to a Biden voter in South Carolina, a Black woman, who said that if he gives you a promise, it's a promise kept. You might not see it now, but history will prevail. So there's just a range of voices and a ton of people out in the world who are really thinking about politics. And when they're comfortable enough to talk to the New York Times, it's really a treat, because we're able to show our readers just what's on the minds of their neighbors and of their leaders. And I would be remiss if I didn't leave you with just a few other resources to think about, either in your reporting, your understanding of the 2024 election, or for those student journalists in the room, your coverage. So obviously, the New York Times website, great place to look at coverage of everything having to do with the 2024 election. The Cook Political Report is another great resource. They have a lot of explainers and breakdowns, particularly of down ballot elections. It does require a subscription, but some of the things that they have are free, and they just have really great analysis. The Circle Center at Tufts University does a lot of analysis and polling of young voters, for those of you who are interested in looking more at Gen Z voting behaviors, since it is such an important voting bloc this year. The Institute of Politics at Harvard University also does a lot of polling and analysis of young voters, and really, really great breakdowns on their website as it relates to Gen Z. And again, for the student journalists in the room, or those who are, just starting their journalism careers while still in college, the Student Press Law Center has a lot of really great resources about what to do in covering your campus, how to protect yourself, and how to make sure that you are kind of in the right and have everything that you need as a student journalist. And now I will open it up for questions, if anyone has any more. Thank you.
Quick question in regards to the shift of African American voters away from Biden. How big is that shift?
Well, that is really the question. So if we're looking just at polling, it's a pretty seismic shift. So the numbers show that upwards of 10 to really 15 to 20% of Black voters may shift to Trump. That would be absolutely historic if it came to pass. In 2020, Trump won about a little less than 10% of the Black vote, and that was considered really significant. So if he were to expand those gains, it would really be a restructuring of that voting bloc. Other questions? Yes.
I'm just curious, what's your favorite story that you've written?
Oh, someone asked me this morning. So I was talking about how on Express, where I spent 3 months on our Express desk at the Times, writing about human interest, general interest stories, and I got to interview Jay Leno after he got into a motorcycle accident, so that was really fun. But I think on the politics beat here at the New York Times, One of my favorite stories to report was actually one that I just published a few weeks ago about Black faith leaders who were calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. I was able to talk to so many, Black religious leaders and pastors, a lot of Black organizers, and it just felt like a very urgent story. And it was a really good feeling for me as a journalist between breaking news and also, really landing squarely on something that I've written about a long time, but saying something new. Other questions? Yeah?
I don't know if you've already answered this question or not, but what got you into, what inspired you to take this as a career?
Sure. I always wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to find a way to make sure that I could make money being a writer. But I grew up in a household where the news was always on, and my parents were big news junkies and big into politics. And so my mom was the person who told me to study journalism, and I went to school in Washington. So after really getting into the politics there and being so close to national politics, I knew this was something that I wanted to make a career out of.
So my question is, what is Trump's message that is appealing to Black voters right now?
Well, I think the economy is something that his campaign has leaned really heavily into, saying that the Black business owners and Black small business owners fared better under Trump. That's not entirely true, and Democrats have aimed to kind of counter that, but it is something that's kind of baked in. There was a radio ad that I listened to recently for Black voters in Atlanta that was talking about immigration. It was talking about trans kids playing sports, and I think it was talking about rising prices. And it just said, Biden is doing all of this to you, and it's hurting Black communities specifically. If Trump gets back in office, then you will fare better. And it kind of just leans back into these sort of cultural issues. And so it's not so much what Trump is offering more than it is what he's stoking, which is a lot of discontent with Biden right now among Black voters. And so I think there's there's a feeling among a larger segment of the Black population that Democratic policies don't work for them. And some people have been open or more open to voting for a Republican, especially when Republicans are saying, Democrats have failed you and we won't. And so many people are saying, well, let me take a chance and see what happens. But I think a larger segment, and this is also what I've heard from many experts who study Black voting behavior, community leaders who tell me that they're really worried about this, and some Democrats, which is that, Black voters may not flock to Republicans en masse, but they may just stay home altogether. And that would also be a big problem for Democrats.
This is my last question, I swear.
Oh, sure.
So when you talk about Blacks or Americans or just a certain community, how many people are you considering to actually represent that big number of the community that you're talking about?
Such an important question. So our polling actually surveys less than 1,000 people. But what we do, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues who know this way better than me, but essentially they try to find enough of a representative sample of this group. So even though there are millions of, say, Black voters all over the country, they try to find enough men, women, people of different ages that are representative of that group and ask them the questions to say this is a representative sample, and then take it even more closer to the ground by focusing only on the battleground states so that we have a better sense of where these key, because we know that places like California and New York are almost certainly going to support a Democratic president in November of 24. And that places like Iowa and South Carolina are almost certainly going to support a Republican. But the handful of states that kind of go back and forth is really where we're focused on. And that's what gives us a lot more confidence in being able to say, Trump is ahead of Biden by 5 points.
I also had a question about surveying too. Like, how do you survey the people? Do you just send it out to everyone and then see who sends it back, or do you specifically target groups?
So our survey actually calls people, which is what makes it even more difficult, because often, people, a lot of these phone surveys come to landlines, and very few people have landlines anymore. Or if you get a call from a number that you don't recognize and they immediately start talking at you, you think they're trying to sell you something, so they hang up. So it's a really long process of actually trying to get folks on the phone to answer these questions. And from there, it's really a series of questions. So are you going to vote? If you do you plan to vote for a Democrat or a Republican? If you do, who would that be? How likely are you to support that person? What is your voting history? So it's a pretty long series of questions too, which is, I think, another layer of difficulty when it comes to polling, because you have to find people who have enough time in their day to sit down and really answer these questions. And we try to find likely voters too. So maybe a person answers the phone and they're willing to talk about politics, but then you ask, how likely are you to vote? And it's like, maybe I won't. And that makes it hard too. Yes.
Since you mentioned sampling, I take a lot of research classes, so I'm familiar with that sampling method. My question is that, are there a lot of, let's say, more research-focused job positions in New York Times besides like journalism?
Oh, yes. So I would definitely, again, another plug for the website. I don't know if you've heard of The Upshot, but that is a group of folks who are reporters and journalists, but they're really data reporters. And so they analyze numbers really as a huge part of their job. We also have on our business side a lot of people who just do data analytics. We should talk later I have, I think, a better sense of kind of what folks are doing internally. But yes, to answer your question, there's a lot of people who focus on numbers and data and not just writing. But we are really collaborative, so we rely heavily on them to conduct the polling, which is a really arduous process. And then they rely on us to make sure that we're making sense of those numbers, calling those people back. And then our readers rely on us to make sense of all of that and to report beyond just who's winning and who's losing. Other questions? Can I ask some questions? So folks said that they're planning to vote this year, yes?
I just want to add that some of us who don't put our hands up is because we are not eligible to vote in the U.S.
Yes, that is a challenge. And has anybody voted at the precinct here on campus? I saw that was, you did? Great. And have people gotten any calls or been contacted by campaigns or candidates yet? What about seeing any political advertisements, whether that's on YouTube or Instagram, or if you go to your parents' house and watch TV, watch cable? No?
I saw the Kennedy video on TikTok. It just popped up.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of the candidates are dabbling in TikTok quite a bit now. Yeah, I will say I mentioned earlier I'm from Tallahassee, and so that's right on the Florida-Georgia line. And so in 2022, going to visit my mom, saw a lot of Georgia advertisements and Florida advertisements. So it got to the point where we were like, let's just watch Netflix. Like, let's just turn off cable. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
I have a question. So how does it work if, a lot of politicians want to ban TikTok, but then at the same time, they're also going to start campaigning on TikTok? How does that work?
Someone asked me that this morning, and it's a really important question, and I wish I knew more about it. So in Georgia, I know that TikTok has already been banned in some parts of the state, but yeah, I really don't know exactly how a TikTok ban would work, what kind of issues would come after that, because I know there'd be probably a counter argument or even a lawsuit from the company that owns TikTok if it were to be banned in the United States. yeah, it's tough. But I think that Democratic campaigns are making more of a play on TikTok because they really want to get young people back out to vote and to vote for them, where Republicans see it as more of a national security threat and will find other ways to reach young people.
In Florida, in all Florida state computers.
Is it?
Yes, it is.
I believe it's the same in Georgia as well. So if I'm on FIU Wi-Fi and I try to go to the App Store, because I don't have TikTok, so if I tried to go to the App Store and download it, it'd be like, no, you can't do that.
Even if you have it downloaded before.
Wow.
Or if you look on your website, you can't even click on the website.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's going to be another probably sleeper issue, unexpected issue of 2024, because I spoke to a class earlier this morning and I asked, who here uses TikTok? I think like over half the room did. Like, who here gets like their information or daily information from TikTok? Okay, so a few people. And it's a lot of people see it as a really important lifeline. So I think, there's more to it than just possible election interference or foreign spying or whatever else is being alleged there. But you guys have also given me my homework. I need to go back and make sure I know what's happening with that. So, well, thank you.
One more time, round of applause. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. A reminder, next week we come back to our regular Programming Tuesday Times Roundtable across the hall in GC 150 at 12:30 p.m. We'll have a session focused on identity and athleticism and women in athletics led by the Women's Center here at FIU. So I hope to see you again next week. As always, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you next time.